This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can find all the cards in this video in their store by using the links in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitzahone, and it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. Today, we're going to look at the Avatar creature type. Avatars are aspects or projections of larger powers. The first cards printed with the Avatar creature type are Hand of Justice and Ebon Praetor in Fallen Empires. Personal Incarnation and Gaia's Liege from Alpha were also retroactively given the type. Some avatars are physical embodiments of an ideal or emotion, like Avatar of Fury or Avatar of the Resolute, while others are the projection of stronger beings that normally don't have a physical form. For example, Magic's planes have a world soul which is aware of what's going on in the plane, but if that world soul wants to intervene in the goings-on the plane, it has to have an avatar like the Soul of Theros. Because of the lore behind them, avatars tend to be quite powerful and they generally appear at higher rarities. This isn't the first time I've looked at avatars in an MTG Top 10. I did it way back in the 195th MTG Top 10 in September of 2019. Things have changed enough over the last 4.5 years that I thought it was time to revisit the list. To be eligible for it, a creature had to have the Avatar creature type, or a card had to be able to create an Avatar creature token. In all, there were 120 cards eligible for this video, and in it we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points, this includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like regional championships. Before we get to the top 10, let's talk about the avatars that were on the list in 2019, but didn't make it this time. First, there's Autumn Willow, which was at number 10 last time. This is a card that was given the Avatar type retroactively, so that's why you don't see it on the type line. She was given that type because in the lore she's an embodiment of the forest. Anyway, for 4 generic and 2 green, she's a 4/4 with Shroud, and you can pay 1 green to shut off Shroud until end of turn. Shroud isn't used anymore, but it's basically a worse version of Hexproof. Worse because it even keeps you from being able to target your creature, so it's nice that the Willow actually has the ability to shut it off. She's not the most impressive creature by today's standards, but a 6-mana 4/4 with Shroud was way better back in 1996. Furthermore, at the one Pro Tour where she gained all of her points, the deck building rules required you to include 5 cards from every set in Standard. Homelands is notorious for being filled with bad cards, and Autumn Willow was one of the few cards you could go with that wasn't a complete dud. It's safe to say she'd have fewer than 6 points if it weren't for that deck building restriction. Obviously enough, she hasn't gained any points since 1996, and she's never going to get back on the list. Next, there's Soul of Innistrad, which was at number 9 last time. Like Soul of Theros, which I mentioned earlier, this is the avatar of the world soul of an entire plane. For 4 generic and 2 black, it's a 6/6 with Death Touch. You can pay 3 generic and 2 black to return 3 creatures from your graveyard to your hand, and you can pay the same cost and exile it when it's in your graveyard to get the same effect. Unsurprisingly, it gained all of its points in standard decks with graveyard themes or sub-themes like Sultai Whip and Abzan Control, but it hasn't gained any points since 2015. Lastly, there's Avatar of Woe, which was at number 8 last time. For 6 generic and 2 black, this is a 6/5 with Fear, and it can tap to destroy a creature. While the text box is certainly strong, 8 mana is way too much for this creature, but I have good news. The cost drops to only 2 black mana if there are 10 or more creature cards in all graveyards, and once you're only paying 2 for it, it's pretty insane. The Avatar gained all of its points between 2001 and 2003 in Extended, where it was featured in Reanimator decks. The Avatar nicely does double duty. It's a great graveyard payoff to have in your hand while you're loading the graveyard, and it's not too shabby as a reanimation target itself. Avatar of Woe doesn't have any points though since 2003. Alright, let's move to the list proper, starting with the number 10 card, which is Soul of Windgrace, a newcomer to the list. In the lore, Windgrace is a powerful planeswalker who fused his spirit with Urborg, a region on Dominaria. This avatar is his physical embodiment, which he uses to protect Urborg during the Phyrexian invasion. For 1 generic, 1 black, 1 red, and 1 green, he's a 5/4, and when he enters the battlefield or attacks, you can put a land from a graveyard onto the battlefield tapped under your control. He also has 3 activated abilities that have a mana cost and require you to discard a land. For a single green, you can gain 3 life, for a generic and a red, you can draw a card, and for 2 generic and a black, you can make the soul indestructible until end of turn and tap it. Each of these abilities have their place. Sometimes you need the life to outlast an aggro deck, other times you need to dig deeper in your deck so you go for the second effect, and other times still you want to rumble with Soul of Windgrace, and holding up the ability to make him indestructible makes him a very problematic attacker. And of course, his attack trigger also means you can get the lands back that you discard. In Standard, the Soul has been played in Jund midrange and control decks, but it's seen more play in Modern, where there are more sweet lands it can abuse, like fetch lands, and it can also be played alongside other land-loving cards like Tireless Tracker, which gives you a ton of additional value for bringing those lands back. Soul of Windgrace looks well positioned to gain more points, especially in Modern, and it has a good shot at moving up this list. At number 9, it's Niv-Mizzet Supreme, our second consecutive newcomer to the list. In the lore, Niv didn't start out as an avatar, but he eventually became the physical embodiment of Ravnica's Guild Pact, and ever since then he's been a 5-color creature that has the avatar creature type. He costs 1 of each color of mana, and he's a 5/5 with flying and hexproof from monocolored. He also gives jumpstart to your instants and sorceries that are exactly 2 colors. This means you can cast them by paying their mana cost and discarding a card from your hand. This is a huge flyer that is immune to a ton of removal spells, and if you've got the right spells in your graveyard, he's also a pretty amazing value engine. It's gained all of its points in Pioneer Bring to Light decks. This sorcery lets you tutor up creatures, instants, or sorceries with mana value equal to the number of colors of mana you spend on it, and grabbing Niv with it is pretty nasty because on the next turn you could just cast it again thanks to Jumpstart. Niv-Mizzet Supreme looks well positioned to keep gaining points in Pioneer. At number 8, it's Eon Chronicler, which has dropped 2 slots since 2019. This avatar doesn't have a ton of lore around it, but it seems to be a manifestation of time itself, or at least time magic. For 3 generic and 2 blue, the Chronicler is a star with power and toughness each equal to the number of cards in your hand. It also has Suspend X for X3 and a blue. This means it gets exiled with X time counters on it, and when the last one is removed, you can cast it without paying its mana cost, and it gains haste. The Chronicler also has a triggered ability while it's suspended. Each time you remove a time counter, you get to draw a card. Basically, if you need a creature right away, you can go for it, but if you'd rather draw some extra cards, something the Chronicler synergizes well with, you can go that route too. It can be particularly useful that it's very difficult to deal with the Chronicle's ability to draw you extra cards, since you aren't technically casting it when you suspend it. It was featured pretty heavily in block and standard control decks in 2007, which could use the Chronicler both as a source of card advantage and a potential win condition. It hasn't gained a single point in the last 17 years though. At number 7, it's a Johnny Goldman, which has fallen 3 spots in the last 5 years. For 2 generic and 2 white, it's a 4 loyalty planeswalker, and actually one of the original 5 planeswalkers from Lorwyn. Anyway, he makes it on this list thanks to his -6, which creates an avatar token with power and toughness each equal to your life total, a callback to Sarah Avatar. He also has a +1 that gains you 2 life, and a -1 that puts a +1/+1 counter on all of your creatures and gives them vigilance until end of turn. If you can protect the Johnny and use the +1 a couple of times, that avatar can be pretty scary. He saw play in a lot of aggressive white decks while in block and standard because that -1 can be pretty devastating on a well-developed board. Johnny Goldman hasn't gained any points since 2010 though. At number 6, it's Figure of Destiny, which was at number 2 last time. For 1 red-white hybrid mana, it's a 1/1. You can pay 1 red-white hybrid mana to make it a 2/2 Kithkin Spirit, 3 red-white hybrid mana to make it a 4/4 Kithkin Spirit Warrior, but only if it's already a spirit, and then there's the last ability, which is what gets it on this list. You can pay 6 red-white hybrid mana, and if the figure is a warrior, it becomes an 8/8 Kithkin Spirit Warrior avatar with flying and first strike. This sort of creature that has abilities that allow it to slowly upgrade itself is something we see every few sets or so. For example, in Karlov Manor, we have 10th District Hero, and this is where we first saw this kind of design. I think they're great because they tell a story. In the case of the figure, he starts out as a regular Kithkin but dies on the battlefield and becomes a spirit, and over time he eventually becomes an incredibly powerful avatar of destiny. In particular, probably an avatar of those who are destined to die on the battlefield like he did. Anyway, obviously this Kithkin is a powerful 1-drop since it can scale throughout the game and be relevant on almost any board. Unsurprisingly, it's been played in red and white aggro decks in block, standard, extended, and modern, but it hasn't gained any points since 2018. At number 5, it's Progenitus, which was in the same slot last time. Progenitus is the physical embodiment of Alara's World Soul. For 2 mana of each color, it's a 10/10 with protection from everything, and if it would be put into a graveyard from anywhere, you reveal it and shuffle it into its owner's library. For a while, Progenitus was the scariest creature in the game, and it was what you wanted to cheat into play in multiple formats. After all, it can't be killed by any targeted removal, it can't be blocked by anything, and it can't be damaged by anything, and it can end the game in 2 swings. This led to people wanting to put it into play with Hypergenesis in Extended, Show and Tell in Legacy, and Oath of Druids in Vintage. In addition to that sort of thing, it was also used in Infect decks in both Modern and Legacy that looked to use Blazing Shoal to buff an Infect creature like Glistener Elf and win the game in a single swing. Progenitus was never cast in those decks either, instead getting exiled to the Shoal for a huge buff. Progenitus's best days are probably behind it though. Now, this isn't to say Progenitus doesn't see any play these days. After all, he has gained 16 points over the last 4 years, and he is being played right now in decks like Legacy Elves and Cradle Control, which can cheat it into play with Natural Order, but it's far from the premier creature you want to cheat into play anymore. I mean, why would you want to when you have Atraxa? Still, Progenitus is going to gain some more points, but not really enough to move up this list since every card in front of it is also very active, like our number 4 card, which is Niv-Mizzet Reborn, a newcomer to the list. We've already talked about how Niv-Mizzet has become the living embodiment of Ravnica's Guild Pact. Well, this card represents when that first happened. For one of each color, he's a 6/6 flyer with a great enter the battlefield ability. You get to reveal your top 10 cards, and then for each color pair, you can choose a card that's exactly those 2 colors from among them and put it into your hand. And you put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. In the decks Niv is played in, most of your cards are exactly 2 colors, so normally you get this huge flyer in play and draw like 4 cards, at which point the game is usually over. He didn't do much in Standard because mana wasn't good enough and the card pool wasn't large enough to build a functional deck where he could draw you lots of cards, but Niv-Mizzet Reborn decks have been a fixture in Pioneer ever since he got printed, and an eponymous deck also appears occasionally in Modern. While the cards in front of it are likely to continue to gain points, Niv-Mizzet Reborn has a real chance of potentially moving higher on the list. At number 3, it's Dark Depths, which has moved up from the number 7 spot. This legendary land can't produce mana, and it enters a battlefield with 10 ice counters on it. You can pay 3 generic and remove an ice counter, and once it has no ice counters on it, you get a 20/20 flying indestructible avatar creature token. This token is the avatar of Merit Lage, an interplanar being of extreme power. Dark Depths didn't do a whole lot for the first several years of its history. In fact, it was considered one of the worst cards in the game. It was way too slow to ever do anything, and the fact it can't even produce mana was a huge burden. However, that all changed in a big way thanks to the printing of Zendikar's Vampire Hexmage, which could easily sacrifice itself to remove all the counters from a permanent, and that meant you could get the 20/20 as early as turn 2. Since Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth could even make it so Dark Depths could tap for mana. When Modern was created in 2011, it was preemptively banned to keep this incredibly fast combo from existing, and it's a good thing too, because in the years since then, the printing of Thespian Stage has made the combo even more consistent. The stage can copy Dark Depths, but because it's already in play and doesn't get the counters, you immediately get the token. This card is incredibly important in Legacy, where there's an entire archetype called Lands that features the Dark Depths Thespian Stage combo as one of its main win conditions. Vintage Dark Depths decks have also been a factor intermittently. Over the last several years, Dark Depths decks in the Eternal formats have enjoyed a lot of success, allowing Dark Depths to amass a ton of points. The 2 cards in front of it are active too, but Dark Depths has been active enough over the last several years that it's difficult to say it has no chance to move up the list. At number 2, it's Death's Shadow, which lost its number 1 spot on the list. Death's Shadows are avatars that seem to be a physical embodiment of death itself, and especially near-death experiences. As that flavor would indicate, Death's Shadow is a creature that loves it when you're almost dead. For 1 black mana, it's a 13/13, and it gets -X/-X, where X is your life total. Like Dark Depths, this is a card that it took quite some time for people to find a way to use. After all, it might cost 1 mana, but you can never play it early because of its text box, so it's not that exciting that it's so cheap. Eventually, though, players found a way to unleash Death's Shadow's potential, once there was a critical mass of powerful cards that lower your life total. This includes fetch lands and shock lands, of course, but also free card draw like Street Wraith, disruption like Thoughtseize, and Phyrexian mana cards like Mutagenic Growth. So Death's Shadow decks tend to be aggro decks loaded up with these types of effects, and then they can win the game out of nowhere by paying life and casting something like Temur Battle Rage for lethal. Even though the Shadow dropped a spot on the list, it has gained a ton of points over the last several years. It's just that the number 1 card on the list has been even more active, and that card is Hogo Arisen Necropolis, which has moved up 2 spots since 2019. You probably predicted this, provided you remembered that Hogo has the avatar creature type. As with Eon Chronicler, there's no official lore for Hogo, but based on the art and the name, My headcanon is that he's the avatar of the dead buried at a particular necropolis. Perhaps there were so many people buried there that they somehow created a hive mind and animated their burial place. Whether he has detailed lore or not, Hogok is a completely insane magic card. For 5 generic and 2 black-green hybrid mana, he's an 8/8 with Trample that can be cast from your graveyard, but you can't spend mana to cast Hogok. That last part would be a pretty big hurdle, but he also comes with 2 cost reduction mechanics that make it very easy not to spend any mana: Convoke and Delve. It was printed in Modern Horizons, so it was never legal in formats like Standard or Pioneer, but Modern, Legacy, and Vintage are all formats where loading the graveyard quickly is very easy. And you can cast Hogok very early, like on turn 2 with regularity. In Modern, this could be best accomplished with Bridge from Below and Altar of Dementia. The bridge could populate the board from the graveyard for the Convoke, and the altar would mill a ton of cards for the Delve. Hogok was only legal in Modern for 2 months before getting banned there, but Hogok has been powerful enough to continue to put up points in the Eternal formats. He's found significant success in Legacy, and in Vintage he's been utilized too. Its primary home in Vintage is Bazaar of Baghdad decks. This is a deck loaded up with discard and draw effects like the Bazaar that intends to then rapidly populate the board with creatures who can come out of the graveyard or who have casting costs of 0 as a result of all the cards discarded. In that deck, it isn't that unusual for Hogok to come down on turn 1 alongside several other creatures. Hogok is going to continue to amass points in both Legacy and Vintage, and it has a good chance at maintaining its #1 spot on this list. So those are Magic's most powerful avatars. If you'd like to play with any of them, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it to increase its reach. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on the more than 700 other MTG Top 10s, including many more that look at specific creature types, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can do that by becoming a channel member or a patron. You can find ways to do those things in the description. Thanks for watching.